So, tonight's topic is really about estate planning and how it creates generational wealth. And this is entirely by design and not at all by accident. So, this is something that I learned really by chance in a way. I've always, of course, been fascinated by wealth, those great wealth creators and generators. But how do you sustain it? How do you keep it so that it passes from generation to generation? Historically, even many of those original, particularly from the Gilded Age, incredible wealth creators did not manage to have that generation pass on, at least not past the third generations. So there is a kind of overused statement of from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. So quite often it is a generation that starts out in shirt sleeves, and then I guess they're moving to tuxedos, and then they're back to shirt sleeves. So it's a common expression that is used, and one of the dilemmas was how do we ensure that this wealth that we have created through hard work and sacrifice in most cases, that it continues to be a shelter for the family as well as to do some good for society? How do we keep that wealth from just being essentially, in some cases, wasted? Although I'm going to talk a little bit about the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And the Vanderbilts, in a way, have been treated somewhat unfairly because a lot of the wealth that was allegedly wasted or lost actually did go to philanthropy. So that should not actually be lost on, where the money has actually gone. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about me. What qualifies me actually to even put on such a presentation? I found myself in banking. I have always been a lawyer, but a lot of banks and their trust departments hire almost only exclusively lawyers. And that is because lawyers understand risk and lawyers understand fiduciary responsibility. So, as a result of that, I did start working in wealth management, and I had the opportunity to meet some people that you and I would consider to be regular Joes. They had in some cases, some very normal jobs, these days they're calling it boring businesses, right? They were painters or electricians or you name it, they're calling it boring businesses, but these boring businesses actually make a lot of money, and these boring businesses will probably not be wiped out by AI either. So these types of businesses that require some kind of technical know-how that none of us will ever be able to escape, you're still going to need someone to climb up on your roof. You're still going to need, somebody to uh, check the toilets. You're going to need someone to do all of these things. So AI is not going to replace that. And these individuals who were in these types of trades had already amassed quite a bit of wealth, and they were great with making money, and they wanted to learn how to preserve it and to ensure really that their grandchildren would have some advantages from their hard work. So that's how my journey started in banking, and I'm actually thrilled that it did. So estate planning does create generational wealth by design. Estate planning goes back to good old England, but it has been perfected, I believe, in the United States, largely by a lot of those industrial titans, mostly during the Gilded Age and, of course, some after. But what estate planning does do is provide true control. So the creator of that wealth still has a measure of control as to how those assets are used once they're no longer alive. And this can be extremely important, especially if, again, you've created a massive amount of wealth, which could sustain generations and also do a lot of good for the rest of society. It also has a legacy focus. Most people will say, well, what legacy? Well, we all are leaving a legacy. But when you have a wealth, substantial wealth, or not even substantial wealth, but wealth that you're passing on, that is part of your legacy. Your legacy is your story. Your legacy can also be who or what it is that you want to carry on. Is there certain charities that you want to make sure that continues? Is there a church or a synagogue that you want to ensure that they continue to receive your funding? This can all be a part of your legacy, and this is part of your focus, especially if you're leaving behind some fairly significant wealth. Estate planning also ensures some measure of family harmony. You can prevent a lot of discord, meaning lawsuits, if you define roles and intentions. And a lot of the lawsuits in families is really a result of people actually not having an actual discussion. I believe this is mostly generational, and you see a lot of change in estate planning practices, in calling family meetings, trying to let those next generations know about either family businesses or philanthropic organizations or whatever it is that the family does, having them have knowledge and also providing them with an education about the family. This is very key. This not only ties to legacy, but of course to family harmony. And what is the good of creating all of this incredible wealth and there's no family harmony or unity to be spoken of? And number 4, it does ensure the financial stability across those generations. This is going to be set forth in the documents that are created. Estate planning is not about death. It truly is not. It is a structure. It is a goal. The goal is, admittedly, continued control so that you, as that creator of wealth, will ensure that your wishes are followed after you die. It secures continuity, protects the family and business operations from unexpected disruptions, and it provides clear guidance. Again, if you're having those conversations are being held, you can avoid those future conflicts. So what generational really is, how it really starts, is first and foremost avoiding probate. Probate is the court's supervision of the distribution of assets when a person dies. Now, even if you have a will that has to go through probate, the court establishes that the will is valid. If you don't have a will, the court establishes who your rightful heirs are and then proceeds to make the distribution. In both cases, the court is overseeing the distribution of your assets. So avoiding that entire process, which is not only expensive but lengthy, is really key. They like to say time is money. Well, you're looking at, in the best case scenario, maybe 6 months, but it's more likely going to go on to a year or longer. And cost, well, your average trust preparation is probably going to cost anywhere from $2,500 to $6,000, but your average probate cost will start initially with a retainer of around $10,000 to $12,000, and there will be a certain percentage that will be allowed. So you're usually looking, even with a modest estate, at around $30,000 or so in cost and fees. So that is a tremendous savings, and it's really a shame that some of the smaller estates are actually having to pay that price. Those heirs are not getting those funds. That's going to attorney's fees for the most part. Secondly, you're stabilizing property. It's ensuring that properties are maintained and not being sold hastily, as in a fire sale. You're going to ensure that there are enough funds to maintain that property, even if it is the wish that the property is sold. It doesn't have to be sold like a hot potato. It can actually perhaps even be slightly renovated, to provide more appeal so that it actually sells at a better price. So this is key, and that also creates more wealth for the family. If there's a business involved, especially a family business, it's going to allow that structure to continue to thrive without interruption. This is really key. Without interruption and chaos as to who is doing what. There is some thought as to who is succeeding that business owner, who's continuing to run that business. And then it defines leadership. This also empowers families and gives them a direction for the future. So why does wealth fail to transfer? A lot of my clients are entrepreneurs, and so quite often they either don't have operating agreements at all, and I'm talking about solo entrepreneurs, so they are a single member entity basically. They don't have operating agreements, so that's one thing. So there's no clear outline as to, the actual transfer of the assets of the business in the event that something happens to them. Or they have agreements, and those agreements actually don't reflect their current circumstances. They don't have incapacity plans. Now, you do have to plan for that day when you can no longer make decisions. That can happen literally at the blink of an eye. The assets are isolated. So what I mean is that, you've got a home here, you've got a home there. There's no clear overview of what the assets are. The trust or a trust serves as a fantastic container that also inventories all of the assets so that they are known, where they are is known. All of these things, it's very important. So having things scattered, I used to know people who, would keep certain amounts in 4 or 5 different banks. They grew up during a time when banks failed, the Great Depression, and so they never kept all of their capital in one bank. They would have maybe that's $250,000 in one bank, $250,000 in another bank, and so on. But then you've got 5, 6, 7 banks that you have to concern yourself with, and if God forbid you cannot remember those banks and something happens to you, your family is going to have a lot of fun trying to track down those assets. You've got LLCs, but they're not really aligned. So in order to do that, I always recommend that there's some coordination so that these assets can be managed most effectively. And again, we're talking about probate, decisions, and courts. They decide the asset distribution, and that prolongs resolution. And this is one of the reasons why a pretty fair amount of the wealth does not transfer. So what's the cost of no structure? Well, you've got lost control. The family loses control once the courts take over with regard to the estate decisions. And you've got increased stress. You've got legal battles and decisions that lead the family to tension and stress. That's usually the cost of no structure, because someone who created wealth did not take the time to decide how they wanted that wealth to be distributed once they were no longer here. It cost the family quite a bit. Generational wealth is absolutely created by structure. So you're going to have asset organization structures, which help to organize and protect the assets for longevity. You're going to have legacy assurance. That's going to be set forth, and it's going to endure. And you're going to have financial continuity, because that provides the family really with the outline to sustain those financial resources. Trusts create continuity. How do they do that? Well, they do prevent the fire sales, right? They're selling assets under duress. Trusts safeguard those assets for the benefit of future generations. It centralizes ownership. Trust is that owner, that container. Everyone knows everyone knows that the trust is that owner. It manages, it preserves that management. So it ensures ongoing business management and operations. And again, we're looking at probate avoidance, which I hope people are not sick of hearing me saying, but if you don't avoid anything else, avoid this. Excuse me. So I have a client, her name is Mona, and Mona is this incredible serial entrepreneur. She owns a lot of real estate, and she owns a lot of businesses associated with real estate ownership, especially with real estate ownership that is commercial. So because of her, she has the cleaning business that cleans the properties and all of the different types of related businesses to maintain and preserve a property, which is really smart. She also doesn't have any kids, so as of yet, there's no clear line of ownership. Once she passes away, there are no heirs. And her agreements are not really aligned. The operational agreements for the LLCs are not in order. So what proper planning will do, first of all, we're going to ensure that those properties stay productive and well managed in the event that Mona should become incapacitated or passes away. That's huge. We're going to avoid probate, of course, because the membership of the LLCs will be transferred into the trust, which will provide that probate avoidance. There's going to be a continuity of income from those properties. That doesn't have to cease because the management is still there and in place. And we're protecting the future assets and the opportunities for those future generations simply by creating a trust for Mona. Again, generational wealth is not sustained by accident. The planning does have to be intentional, and it does create chaos. So I will go and talk about, the most common kind of example that is provided, and I guess it's a little bit unfair, but it's just historically something that occurred. You have the wealth of the Vanderbilts, who during the Gilded Age had, I think Cornelius Vanderbilt in today's currency maybe had about 200 billion, so richer than anyone had ever been. So in today's value. So he did leave 95% of his wealth to his oldest son and the 5% distributed amongst the other children. I believe he had 3 other children. And that son did well. He doubled the Vanderbilt wealth. So second generation was yay. He did well. Third generation, so the children of those children were not interested in business. They were interested primarily in being philanthropists. And again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but there was not a structure to ensure that they would not give all of the money away, which, of course, if that's something you want to do, you can. And there was not a structure as to how they would sustain their children or their children's children. And when you hear that somebody has a wealth of around $400 billion, I guess once the oldest son was done, that kind of should go several generations. It really should. And it can do and sustain some great things. There's no doubt about that. So the Rockefellers created structures, family trusts, family banks, a number of other family offices, a lot of things that a lot of us will not be doing. However, we can learn from how, through starting out with that initial trust structure, that wealth is used as we want it to be used. So maybe there is a portion of it that should be used for philanthropy, and then there should be portions of it, or could be portions of it, that will be used for future generations in terms of education or starting businesses, for example. That is another great way in which to ensure that future generations will have a chance, either through education, helping with a business, perhaps a down payment on a home, such things of this nature, to ensure that that generation also has some ability to maintain the wealth that has been created by a loved one. So, what is necessary? You really do need a trust. You really do. You're going to start out with a pour over will. How is that different from what is typically called a last will and testament? The pour over will transfers assets into the trust. The regular last testament and will, or last will and testament, basically just decides where your assets will be distributed upon your death, and it will also, if there are minor children, determine guardians. But it's not useful until you die. The revocable trust, on the other hand, is not only for when you die, but also for while you're alive. So this container assists with the management and the oversight of your assets. And again, it does that wonderful thing of avoiding probate. You're also going to need a durable power of attorney. It's not a matter of if, but more likely than not when you would become incapacitated. Who would you want to make decisions for you? This is crucial and key, especially in terms of ensuring generational wealth. And then there are the healthcare directives. Here you're actually telling someone what your healthcare preferences are in critical situations. So these are all documents that are going to help protect you as a person and your assets and entities. Trust structures for asset protection. So I'm just naming some common ones. I have special needs trust on here because they are asset protection. And I started out in the world of special needs trust. What they really do is they provide for dependents with disabilities while they preserve public benefits. Why is this important? Well, you don't want to leave funds outright to an individual who is disabled and receiving public benefits, because this will disqualify them from those public benefits. So special needs trusts can be critical within family planning if there is a member of the family that has a disability and who will need public benefits. And they more likely than not will need them, because disability is really the inability to work. Without work, there's usually, most of us have our health insurance tied to our employer. Or if we are self-employed, we are utilizing other vehicles, whether it's the marketplace or groups in which we can get our health insurance. But if you have a disability and you cannot work, it is much tougher. So, and especially if it's really critical, it's extremely expensive. It's expensive without being critical. But if it is a critical injury or illness or a type of disability that requires a lot of medical intervention, it is and will be extremely expensive. So government benefits are very helpful in this case. It ensures that the family does not actually end up going broke to sustain a loved one with a disability. Spendthrift trust. The reality is that most trusts have spendthrift clauses to ensure that beneficiaries don't squander their inheritance. So that's the 18 or 20-something-year-old that runs off to Vegas with 20 of their closest friends, and they party at one of those great hotels for, a long weekend. Things like that we've all probably heard of. So this means that those funds will not be available for this type of thing. It also protects them from lawsuits, creditors, judgments, any type of thing that could occur. It's protecting them from that. And then you have the irrevocable trust, which protect assets from creditors and liens. That's because you're taking the control of those assets and you're providing them to a third party. So unlike the revocable trust, where typically you or I or whoever has the trust created, we're retaining that control as the trustees until we're incapacitated or no longer here. Then it becomes irrevocable. But before that point, it is revocable and it does not provide asset protection. It provides asset protection for our beneficiaries if the trust continues, but not for us. So this is key for people to really understand that. So true asset protection is really going to come through that irrevocable trust. So I want to thank you for taking part of a Saturday evening to join me, which is really incredible. If you desire more information, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the screen, DeniseLitauPA@proton.me. My website is www.deniselitaupa.com. And my phone is area code 954-296-0493. So I want to thank you. I'd love to hear from you in terms of whether or not this was informative. I didn't want to go on too long. It is actually a Saturday evening. So please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.